But if I say I will not mention his word,
But if I say, I will not mention his word,
But if I say I will not mention his word,
or speak any more in his name,
or speak any more in his name,
his word is in my heart like a fire.
his word is in my heart like a fire
shut up in my bones.
I am weary of holding it in.
I am weary of holding it in. Indeed,
Indeed,
I cannot.
I cannot.
I cannot.
Indeed, I cannot.
That we don't have in common. And since we're all online today, I'm going to ask you to do a little hand raising. Nobody gets singled out when we raise our hands at home, but this will keep us engaged in the conversation. So I just want you to raise your hand. Raise your hand if you love to read. Now I want you to raise your hand if you don't like reading at all. Here's another one. If you had to choose between a beach vacation or a mountain vacation, but you couldn't choose both, who are my beach people? How about the mountain folks? All right, I know there's another group of people in that category. I can practically hear you screaming at me through the cameras and the screens. You would prefer neither the beach nor the mountains. You would just like to stay home. Here's one more. Who are the planners? The people who like to organize and calculate and schedule and map stuff out. And who are the lovers of spontaneity? You prefer to just get up every day and take life as it comes. This last one is always a fun conversation with a married couple, because the life by the plan person and the life by the impulse person, they both think that their way is the only right way to live. And when I used to do marriage counseling with folks, these were some of the most lively conversations, because the planners, they think you should schedule and map out everything. Parenting, meals, chores, work, bathroom breaks, sleep, and the date and time of the birth of every child. The spontaneous types think that planning sucks the life out of everything. So to this couple, their differences are fun and they're cute for a while until they're not. That's the thing about differences. We often move from respecting them to resenting them. Our differences in personality and preference and culture and color, even politics and perspective, those differences can actually add to the richness of life, can even lead to better answers and solutions and outcomes. Our differences can be beautiful, except when our differences are weaponized. Maybe part of the solution to the chaos in our world today will not be found in highlighting our differences, but in discovering our sameness. Because there are some things that we still all have in common. And I'm going to share with you one today that is a fire in my bones. And it has been for a long, long time. I want to unpack for you an obscure story tucked into the pages of the Bible that is rarely read, seldom taught, and almost never understood. But if you will journey with me, we're going to find something that we all, and I mean all, share in common. And it will absolutely change your life if you'll let it. So here's some background. Now this is going to get a little complicated. I'm going to summarize it in a minute. Try to stay with me. Saul was the king of Israel, first king of Israel. And King Saul had died by the time we get to our story today. David, who is Saul's rival, has now been elevated to the throne and replaced Saul as king. Saul's son, Jonathan, had also recently died. But here's the interesting part. David and Jonathan were best friends. I need to make sure that you're with me. So let me just say it again. Jonathan's dad, Saul, was the king, and Jonathan's best friend, David, is the archenemy of the king. So talk about being in the middle. Before Jonathan is killed in battle, David swears to him, because they're best friends, David swears to Jonathan that he will always take care of Jonathan's family, any of his kids and grandkids and his descendants. Now, you've probably seen this movie, right? Somebody's holding their best friend's hand as they take their final breath, and their dying wish is some version of, watch over my kids. Well, that's what Jonathan says to David. And then Jonathan dies, and Saul has died, and now David is king. And a few years later, this is what happens. David asks, is there anyone still left in the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? And Ziba, who's one of the servants of the king, Ziba answered the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. He's lame in both feet. Well, there is still the son of Jonathan, but he's crippled. Maybe it's just human nature for us to point out all of the ways that we're different. Ziba doesn't even mention this kid's name, but he cannot help himself but to point out the disability, as if that's the most important thing. You and I do this a lot, actually. We look at someone and we size them up based on some kind of qualifier, and usually it's negative. We assess them based on their perceived weakness. We judge them based on their limitation. Well, there is still a son of Jonathan, but he's crippled in both feet. Sure, I know him. He's bipolar. I know her. She's divorced more than once. He's a widower or obese. They smoke pot or they don't. Bankrupt, addict, alcoholic, adulterer. Our list of labels so that we can quarantine groups of people away from wherever we are, it's ever growing. We just keep adding to it. Uber liberals and ultra conservatives, kneelers and standers, mask wearers and mask refusers, COVID reckless and COVID terrified. On and on we can go. Because for some reason, we would rather divide based on our differences than unite around our commonality. Well, there is still a son of Jonathan, but he's crippled in both feet. I think Ziba's descriptor, though we're not told this, I'm reading between the lines in the Bible, and I encourage you to do that too. This is a matter of interpretation, but I think Ziba's descriptor was intended to be a deterrent. I think what he was saying to David is kings don't mingle with non-royal types. Kings don't associate with those who are broken. And if anybody meets this qualification, it's got to be someone who can't walk. We're first told about this son of Jonathan right after Jonathan was killed in battle. It goes like this. Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became disabled, and his name was Mephibosheth. That'll be important in a minute. The nanny hears about Jonathan's death, Mephibosheth's dad, and she figures that they're going to come and kill this boy because he's an heir to the throne. This is a crisis. They have to get out. They've got to run for their lives. So she scoops the boy up, but in her panic, she drops him, probably on his head, although we're not told that specifically. Again, reading between the lines, what we think is that he suffered a brain injury and it cripples him. And this, ironically, strangely, is kind of where the story gets good. See, most of the story of Mephibosheth is lost on us because of its language. Mephibosheth's story, as is the most of the Old Testament, is written in the language of ancient Hebrew. And it's translated many years later into modern English. And so we get the words in English, except the names, all of the proper names, people and places, they're given to us in their original language, like Mephibosheth, which is a Hebrew name. So for all you parents, I want you to remember for a minute, this will just a little tangent, stay with me. I want you to remember when your kids were learning to talk, but they couldn't yet read. Remember how we used to talk in code? Some of you are there now with your little kids. It's a fun part. This is a spoiler alert. I have bad news for you if you're still doing this with your kids. Because we used to talk in code, Susan and I did, either for really good things or for not so good things. So I would say to Susan, one of us needs to give him a BATH. Or Susan might say, listen, the kids are going to get excited about this. I don't want to tell them right now, but later today I'm going to take them to the POOL. Or at that time of year, we would say, hey, who's going to get ready for SANTA? And then there was that day when you spell something for your kids out loud in front of them so that they can't understand you, and one of your kids says, hey, you guys know that I can read now, right? So at that moment, you start thinking about learning an obscure language together so you can still speak to each other in code. Well, there are places in the Bible that speak to us in code. And for me, this story is like that. And once I deciphered it, I realized that this story wasn't just an ancient story, it was about me. And if I could be so bold, it's about you. It became a fire in my bones. So let me read to you one more part, and then we're going to start to decode it. It goes like this. The king asked, is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? And Ziba answered the king, there is still a son of Jonathan, but he is lame in both feet. Where is he? The king asked. Ziba answered, he's at the house of Machir, son of Amiel, in Lodabar. So the king had him brought from Lodabar. Now, we already know, even though his name is not mentioned in this part, he's mentioned in another part, we already know that the name of this descendant of Jonathan, Ziba talks about, who's crippled in both feet, his name is Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth means scattered shame. Scattered shame, because this kid was broken. Came from a broken family, ends up being broken physically. They were ashamed of him. We'll see in a minute, he's ashamed of himself. And in their shame, they tried to hide him. They tried to hide his brokenness. Isn't that what you and I do? We allow our brokenness to become our shame. And because it's our shame, we're ashamed of it. We try to hide it. And when we hide it, we turn it into a secret. And secrets create all kinds of anxiety inside of us and in people around us. We're constantly looking over our shoulder, wondering who's going to find out about our secret. We're trying to control leaks. We might even be telling some lies, all so that nobody else finds out about our brokenness. And for some, we even start lying to ourselves, creating this false narrative that says, I'm not broken. Look, I want to tell you a powerful, life-altering reality. It comes in this story. It's going to come in a few minutes. I can't wait to tell you about it, but you will never have access to it until you realize this. The gateway to this life-altering truth that we're going to discover in a few minutes, before you get to that, you got to know this. There are two kinds of people. Broken people who know it and broken people who don't. But everybody is broken. Everybody. The Bible is filled with story after story of people who are broken. Even people we look back on and revere, people like Moses and Abraham, David himself, Isaiah and Solomon, and people the church gave sainthood to, like Peter and Paul. Every single one of these giants of faith, without exception, is a broken person. And if they were broken, how can you not see that you're broken too? The truth is that there are two kinds of people. There are broken people who know it, and there are broken people who don't. But everybody is broken. Everybody, including me, especially me. For all of our differences, this is the thing we have in common. Everybody is broken. And the question is, do you know that you're broken? Are you willing to admit that you're broken? Get the secret out. Because once we can say it, once we can name it, we can begin to see ourselves on the same level as everybody else. No better, no worse. The specifics of our brokenness, the causes of it, the manifestation of our brokenness and how it will look, all those things are different, but at the core, it's all the same. We're all broken people trying to live in a broken world that, frankly, we helped to break. The Bible is filled with this truth, both in story and in teaching. The psalmist wrote that everyone has sinned and strayed from the unbroken intent that God had in the beginning. So Mephibosheth means scattered shame. And he lived in this place called Lo-Debar. And Lo-Debar means the barren place. When you try to hide your brokenness, when your scattered shame wins the day and your life is all about pretending that brokenness isn't real and convincing everybody else that you don't have brokenness inside of you, when that happens, it inevitably leads you to the barren place where it's lifeless and lonely. Mephibosheth is in Lo-Debar, the barren place, and he's crippled. He's broken. He defines scattered shame. He can't just walk out of the barren place. He can't walk at all. He's stuck there. He's in no man's land. How will he ever get out of Lo-Debar? Now remember, Mephibosheth is the grandson of a king. He's King Saul's grandson. So he has the blood of a king running through his veins. Royalty is in his DNA, and yet he's still in the barren place. So what do you do if your broken and desperate child finds himself living in the barren place? I've known parents whose hearts were ripped apart when their adult child goes to the barren place with their life. It's probably the single hardest thing that some parents ever go through, because when you find that your child is in the barren place, you as a parent never quit caring. You never quit agonizing. You never quit longing for a right relationship with your kid. You just want them to come home. And if it was possible, every parent with an estranged adult child would go get them and bring them home. That's exactly what David did. David sent for Mephibosheth. He sent a delegation to Lo-Debar, to the barren place, picked up Mephibosheth in his scattered shame, and came from his brokenness all the way back to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem means the place of peace. He could have been left in his brokenness in the barren place, but the king chose to go get him. When I put these pieces together, when I decode the story like this, I realize this story is about me. It's about us. What we cannot do for ourselves, God did for us. The Bible says that God showed how much he loved us like this. While we were still broken, scattering our shame, living in the barren place that we couldn't get out of, while all that was happening, Jesus Christ came and he died for us. And in that way, this story, while it really happened, is also an allegory. It isn't ancient history. It's our story, or at least it can be. I want you to see what happens, and then we'll understand more of how this works in our own lives. When Mephibosheth came to David, he bowed down to David to pay him honor. And David said, "Mephibosheth." "At your service," Mephibosheth replied. "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all of the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Mephibosheth bowed down and he said, "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" And so Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, the place of peace, and he was lame in both feet. So after he gets there, after the king goes and picks him up and he ends up at the king's house, Mephibosheth bows down to David, scared to death that the king is going to put him to death, because that's what kings do, right? To those who are a threat to the throne. So Mephibosheth says, "Who am I that you should notice a dead dog like me?" Now he's standing in the presence of the king. Mephibosheth still defines himself with his shame, calls himself a dead dog. Many of us struggle with this because of what you've done, or because of what you've experienced, or because of what somebody else did to you. Even though you're standing in the presence of the king, you might still feel your shame, and you might feel like God just doesn't want you. You're in the barren place, living in your scattered shame, and I have met a lot of people like this. 6 years ago, I went to the hospital to see a longtime friend named Jerry Clay. I'd been privileged to be the pastor to Jerry and many of his family for many years to that point, and I'd gotten to know Jerry, and like all of us, Jerry had a past. But by comparison, he lived a pretty honorable life. This day, when I went to see him in the hospital, he was an old man, he was dying, and though he had been a part of my church and he had heard me teach about God's love and forgiveness and grace many times, here he is at the end of his life, and he asked me this question. He said, "Brian, I have to know, would God really want a sinner like me? Would God really want a sinner like me?" Tucked behind his question was really a statement. I don't know all that was in Jerry's past, but I do know this. He did what most of us tend to do. He wandered in his scattered shame and his brokenness and wondered if God loved him in spite of it. Would God really want a sinner like me? Really? I told Jerry that there was little I was 100% sure of in this life, but this much I knew for sure. The King made a promise. And if we will take him by the hand and go with him, we can leave the barren place and we can join him in the place of peace where we will forever eat at the King's table, brokenness and all. I want you to note that the last thing we're told in this story is a reminder of Mephibosheth's condition. This is the very end of it, kind of the last thing we hear about him, and the writer can't help but remind us that he always ate at the king's table, but he was lame in both feet. I've come to find this as the best part. Listen, he sat at the king's table, not conditioned on his healing, but in spite of his brokenness. He sat at the king's table, not conditioned on his healing, but in spite of his brokenness. The king wanted Mephibosheth because the king made a promise, and he was going to keep it. And all Mephibosheth had to do was take the hand, join the king in the place of peace, and forever eat at his table. As I sat with Jerry and I talked about his question, would God really want a sinner like me? As we talked about this, I noticed a tray of eggs and bacon in front of him. That plastic cup of orange juice was still sealed under the aluminum foil lid. You know, that hospital tray that is L-shaped and they wheel right there so you can eat it in bed. The plasticware was still wrapped in the napkin. None of the food had been touched. And after a while, it became kind of awkward. So I thought Jerry was being polite, and I finally said, "Hey, Jerry, I ate before I got here. Go ahead, eat." And he immediately looked away. And there was a long pause. And then he said, "I can't lift my hands. I can't get the fork to my mouth." "Jerry," I said, I was fighting tears. I said, "Would you like me to feed you?" And he said, "You shouldn't have to feed me." He was still ashamed of his brokenness, his weakness. And so I took a step closer and I looked him right in the eye and I said, "Jerry, I'd be honored to feed you your breakfast today." And one bite at a time, in one of the holiest, most sacred moments of my life, I did for him what he could no longer do for himself. I fed him his eggs. I wiped his mouth a few times. I held the juice to his lips. And as I did these things, I thought about Mephibosheth. And I pondered Jerry's question, and I reflected on my own life. all of us are broken. We all at times ask Jerry's question, and we can all settle this today, once and for all. Jesus Christ the King left the place of peace to rescue us in our scattered shame from the barren place, so that in spite of our brokenness, we could eat at the King's table for the rest of this life and for the life to come. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the King's table, and he was lame in both feet.
Cannot speak, and if the ground beneath your feet feels unstable, well, there's a place for you at my table. If you're broken, you are welcome. If you're outside looking in, if you have no of your own, my door is open. It's always open for anyone wondering if you belong, to anyone who feels afraid and not that strong. If you wanted to be confident but you weren't able, well, there's a place for you at my table. If you're broken, you are welcome. If you're outside looking in, if you have no place for your own, my door is open. It's always open. When the road ahead is long, it doesn't matter where you go, you're never too far gone. But even if you've lost your way and you've been unfaithful, well, there's a place for you at my table. Oh yeah, there's a place for you at my table. If you're broken, you are welcome. If you're outside looking in, if you have no place of your own, my door is open. It's always open. My door is open. It's always open.
There is a place for you at the table. If you're in the barren place in your scattered shame, all you have to do is accept the hand of the one who came to get you. And I think some of you are ready. In spite of our brokenness, we can sit at the King's table. There's a place for us. And I want to invite you to do that right now. I want to invite you with me to pray a simple prayer that will allow you to accept the invitation that the King wants to make. Would you just pray with me right now? God, some of us have been living in our scattered shame, and we're in the barren place, and we realize today, maybe for the first time, that you want us not to get fixed before we come, but that in spite of our brokenness, we can eat at the King's table like one of your children, because we are your children. You're the parent who came to get us, to take us back to the place of peace. So some of us might need to say today, God, for the first time, I'd like to come home. I would like to accept your hand. I would like to admit my brokenness and ask God that you might take me and let me sit at your table. We're going to believe that today. We trust you for it. We thank you for it. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. If you prayed a prayer like that at all today, we would like to pray for you. And if you have any other reason you'd like us to pray, we'd like to pray with you. So if you'll just go fill out the welcome card, you can find that on the website. And there's a place at the bottom where you can say, hey, listen, I'd like to sit at the table. And we want to join you. We want to partner with you in this. And also, I want you to know, I did a follow-up video today that will help unpack more of what we've talked about. And so don't miss a chance to do that. Maybe you can watch that by yourself. There's some questions there you can answer, or with your small group or your family. But look, don't stay in the barren place. There's no reason for you to stay there. The Prince of Peace came to get you, to take you to the place of peace. And you can sit at the table today. I hope you'll come back next Sunday. Can't wait to see you, maybe in person or definitely online. Have a great week. We'll see you then.